Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Urbanism Lunch Hour. My name is Stephen Gallagher. I'm from the Academy of Urbanism. Just a few house rules before we start the main event. We have started recording this session, so if you don't want to be seen, please switch off your cameras now. We encourage you to chat and ask questions in the chat box. You'll find the controls for this towards the bottom of your screen. We will probably go through both the presentations and take the chat and questions towards the end of the session. Talk about the event to your friends, to your followers online on Twitter. Please use the hashtag Urbanism Lunch Hour. And a quick plug for next week's event. We're already getting bookings for this. We'll be talking about heritage-led recovery. We have Shane Quinn, Development Director of Belfast Buildings Trust. He will talk about heritage as a mechanism to lead recovery, but also more widely as a way to connect to people and have an authentic understanding of what our places should be in the future. And a quick plug for those up in Scotland, members in Scotland, we have our weekly coffee mornings. They take place on Tuesdays at 11. So contact AOU_Scotland, academyofurbanism.org.uk for more information. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Andreas Markides, our chair.
Good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome from me as well to this lunch hour event by the Academy. We look forward to an enjoyable hour with thought-provoking presentations and discussion. The subject of this event is the effects of that COVID-19 will have had and will have on all of us. It's become a little bit of a cliche, but COVID-19 has changed all our lives. There's no question about that. And transport is one of the main areas that has been most directly affected by the pandemic. So will we ever again get on a bus or a train without anxiety? Will the pandemic mean that there will be more cars on the road as people move away from public transport, or will there be less cars as people choose to stay and work from home? How will our city centres be transformed without any customers to the sandwich bars and coffee shops? And will drive-through cinemas make a triumphant return to our cities? All of these questions we will try and discuss and maybe even answer during the course of this hour. We have two excellent speakers who will try to answer these questions for us and give us much more than that as well. We are going to start with Phil Jones. Phil, in addition to being a good friend, is also a chartered engineer, but he is much more than that, because I like to refer to him as an enlightened engineer who, in addition to highway safety, has been advocating and pioneering good street design, and by being a member of the institution's urban design panel, as well as by being the author, one of the authors of Manual for Streets. Phil will give us an introduction into transport and how things are changing in terms of the way you plan for that. And that will be followed by our second speaker, Henrietta Wamberg, who is a director at Gale Associates with vast experience in placemaking. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the floor to Phil.
Thanks, Andreas. Has the presentation come up okay?
Yes, we can see it.
Great, thank you. Yeah, this is a bit of a general overview because things are moving so fast and there's so much uncertainty I think the truth is that none of us really knows, and that's a bit of an uncomfortable position for people to be in who make their lives and living about predicting the future, which I guess is many of us. Yeah, so transport planners. Sometimes I call myself a transport planner, and we do planning, don't we? That's what we're here for. We're here to plan and envision the future. This is what Wikipedia says planning is: process of thinking about the activities required to achieve a desired goal. So there's that element of what do we want to achieve? We can't plan for something unless we know what we're aiming for. But I also quite like this definition from Alan Lakin, which is bringing the future into the present so that you can do something about it now, which I think is quite an interesting way of thinking about what planning is and what our futures are. So all of this kind of held good until quite recently, I guess, and we think we make these predictions and we speak with great confidence about what the future is going to be like, and we stand up at public inquiries and we guide politicians and so on about what the future will be. But actually, are we so good at it? This is quite an old slide now, but it's from Professor Phil Goodwin, and it just shows what actually happened to traffic growth as against many years of Department for Transport traffic forecasts. And I'm sure all of those forecasts were produced with huge amounts of data and confidence, and actually they were demonstrated to be spectacularly wrong. And it's not just in transport. These are forecasts of population growth by ONS against actual. And so even in normal times, we're not actually that good at predicting the future. But as a nation and local authorities and well, individuals and companies, we make huge investment decisions on the back of these forecasts. And we see the road investment strategy. I think the current figure is £27 billion of capital investment is planned, and government is standing by that. And that's been based on the road traffic forecast of 2018. So the latest attempt by Department for Transport to predict with great confidence what the future is going to be. And they say, yeah, it's forecast to be strong and positive in all scenarios. At least we now have scenario planning. So Department for Transport doesn't actually now talk about a single future. It has accepted that there are different scenarios, there are different potential futures. But as you can see there, they are relatively clustered around a central. And I think it's kind of subliminal that important that the central forecast has a solid line. And even so, even now we're meant to have scenario planning according to the Department for Transport. People still think about that central forecast as representing a single outcome as to what the future is going to be like, and we plan for it. Or does in planning for it and designing for it actually help to make it happen? I think that is perhaps more like the reality. CIHT, Andreas mentioned we're both members of, and Andreas, past president of CIHT, which has a lot to say about highways and transportation and also urban design, and published a report last year around the linkages or lack of them between planning, transport and places, and calling for a stronger linkage between the two so that we actually decide what futures we want. And he talked about the scourge of predict and provide, traditionally focused on predicting future demand to provide capacity. And a better approach would be to decide and provide, with the use of scenario modelling as a technique to decide what sort of outcomes should be set and provide the transport solutions to deliver those outcomes. So what do we actually want to achieve? And one of the things that we all have to try to achieve is a reduction in carbon emissions. And it's really interesting that the Department for Transport, in the run-up to lockdown, one of the last things that it did was publish the Setting the Challenge document on decarbonising transport. Then it was leading to the COP21 conference in, I think it was November of this year, which has now been postponed. But nevertheless, it's a clear intent that this is seen as an important, notwithstanding the £27 billion still being planned to be spent on RIS2, is seen as an important aim of government to make public transport and active travel the natural first choice. it's not actually, it doesn't contain any actions. It is effectively a plan for a plan, but it talks about how government will work with stakeholders, the public, to decide what action should be taken. And it makes the point that on DfT's current policies, it falls far short of the zero carbon policy that is there for 2050 across the economy. And so a lot of action needs to be taken. And it also makes the point of what a huge proportion of our trip making is short, including particularly those short trips that are made by car. So there's a huge potential to change mode for those short trips, which I'm sure Henriette will talk a little bit more about. But then along comes COVID, and we now have the crisis, and how can we not waste this crisis? How can we perhaps use it as what it increasingly becomes clear is a huge point in all kinds of behaviours, not least travel behaviour. And what's been happening? I downloaded this today. That every day now the Department for Transport is publishing data on transport use during the pandemic. You can download that every day, and you can see that car use fell off dramatically during lockdown, and it has grown. But maybe it's me. But can we see a slight tailing off in the slope of that recovery? Are we heading back to, at the moment? I mean, who knows what's going to happen over the weekend when a lot more facilities are opened up. We can also see, obviously, the dramatic reduction in bus use outside London, and I think similar in London as well, but I just chose the London graph. And then separately, what we've seen is that enormous rise in cycling, but again, now tailing off, and big shifts from day to day, perhaps with weather and weekends and so on. A lot of that travel will have been leisure travel because people aren't making journeys to work. So what do we want to happen? What do we want the future to be? Well, the government, again, Mr. Shapps has said he wants this to be an opportunity. He recognises the benefits of cleaner air and quieter streets, and that we've discovered more cycling and walking, and a 70% rise he talks about of the number of people on bikes. And we need them to carry on cycling and to be joined by millions more. And a really strong advice, I mean, not just advice, but an expectation to local authorities to make significant changes to their road layouts to give more space to pedestrians and cyclists and pedestrians. And that has been backed up by money. And it's interesting that the first tranche of funding was announced just in the last couple of days. And those authorities that are really committed to this agenda have been rewarded with more money than they were initially allocated. And those authorities that have not demonstrated that commitment have only had perhaps 25 or 50% of the money that they were initially allocated. So government is pushing quite hard on this agenda, which is very interesting. And some authorities are responding positively to that. So this is Birmingham, which is my nearest big city, and we're doing a little bit of work on this as well. That Councillor Zafar, who's the Cabinet Member of Transport, has said that we cannot go back to the volume of car traffic we had previously in our city. And this is really interesting. I mean, Birmingham was, for many years, motor town, was the UK's Motown, where cars were made and cars were cheap, and the road network and the city was planned around high levels of car use. So that's what some of our politicians are saying. What do some of other people, and I just took the couple of screen grabs. So I was on a call recently organised by Design Midlands, and the host asked people, what do you want to do? You're all on Zoom as we are now. Do you want to work from home, or can't you wait to get back to the office? And only 8% said I can't wait to get back to the office, and 0% said they miss their car. This could be a very skewed sample of planners. But nevertheless, it's quite striking. And then another quote that I saw, this chap is Stephen Kinsella, who's the head of design for Homes England. As you can see, he's also a Liverpool fan. And so in October 2019, he said in that week he'd been to Liverpool, London, Birmingham, Cambridge and Manchester, and he loved it. He was genuinely enthused by it. And now, he says, seems like a lifetime ago and unnecessary. So, perhaps commuting journeys, perhaps business travel, we are going to see, we've all been thrust into this world of virtual meetings. And I think we can all see that actually it has huge benefits for certain types of interaction, and is leading to much more efficiency. So I feel there is prospect that we're going to see less business travel and less commuting. Other people see things differently. So the text on this is quite small, but this is Chris Young, who I've worked with in the past. He's a planning barrister, and he talks about, you can see he's got lockdown hair, and he talked about 13 weeks in t-shirts and shorts, but he wants to meet people face to face. He's a social animal. A life on Zoom, definitely not. So maybe not. But how do people travel? Why do people travel? We can see, interestingly, commuting is only about 15% of trips, and that those business trips that I talked about are less than 5%. And an awful lot of travel is more discretionary, leisure, shopping, and so on, escorting children to school. We can do something about that. But nevertheless, those commuting trips, particularly, happen in the peak hours, and that's when the network is most under stress. And that's when we've historically designed our transport networks to deal with congestion by making the roads big enough to cope with those high peaks for commuting travel. So I think even a 10 or 15% or perhaps more than that reduction in commuting could have a big impact on peak hour traffic. And what does that mean? So as a traffic engineer, I'm familiar with graphs like this, and so I'm sure Andres will be, that it's only as the traffic volumes on a junction reach capacity that the delays go up massively. So that 10 or 15% reduction in peak hour traffic could make a massive difference to the size of junctions that we need, and therefore allow much more reallocation of space, because it's the junctions that control the capacity. And historically, it's been making those junctions bigger that have destroyed so much of our urban fabric, and made for hostile environments for walking and cycling. And I'm nearly there, but just to finish, a couple of other slides. So this is a scheme that was in the Birmingham Transport Plan. It was a widening, and CPOs were published, and it's a widening of the Dudley Road to about a mile to the west of the city centre. And the active travel provision, the cycling provision here is pretty poor, actually. And recently, as part of the Emergency Transport Plan, this scheme has been cancelled. So Birmingham is turning away from investing in making more capacity for car traffic, and is embracing the pop-up work, and actually got 111% of its allocated funding because of that. So just to finish, talk about decide and provide. Who decides? Who is the we that is deciding this? And this is a little graphic I did a few years ago for a cycling conference, and it seems to me there are kind of three actors in this game principally, maybe four with businesses, but we've got the public, and in the context of cycling, we know there's a huge latent demand for cycling. We've seen how it's grown massively as car traffic has gone, and they vote and they have opinions, but they don't make decisions. It's politicians who make decisions ultimately, and are they led by the public who vote? Do they dare to confront the public who think that what they want to reduce congestion is bigger roads, or do they provide leadership to the public and say, actually no, I can see a different future and I'm going to take you with me? And what's the role for the professionals? They advise politicians. Are they there to serve the politicians and do what they want, or can they say to the politicians, yeah, I'm sorry, I would love to do that, but it will never get through safety audit, or the standards don't allow it? What's the role of the professionals? There's a dynamic relationship there, and of course, as the professionals then deliver those better conditions, hopefully that the public will respond to that, and we will see the latent demand for cycling disappear, and we'll see more demand for cycling, and hopefully we can get that little kind of triangle going in a clockwise direction. And just my very final slide, as an example of the congestion charge, a piece of leadership, which Ken Livingstone did, back in get on for 20 years ago now. The press report said that prior to a congestion charge coming in, the opposition to it was massively outweighed the support for congestion charge. So if a referendum had been held, as it was in Edinburgh and Manchester, the congestion charge in London would never have happened. But by the time it came close to happening, it was around 50-50. The public had perhaps been educated to the potential benefits. And as soon as it went in, of course, it flipped over, because all the scare stories of massive congestion around the edge of the congestion charging zone didn't materialise. And by 2006, that support had grown. I think today, if you ask Londoners whether they wanted to remove the congestion charge, they think you're absolutely crazy. And so, so that's an example of that political leadership to help decide what kind of future that we want. So that's it from me, and yeah, I hope that was interesting. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Phil. Some really good thought-provoking ideas there. Thank you for a fantastic introduction to the shifting ground of transport thinking and planning. And thank you also for, making us think as to who is responsible for all this and who makes the decisions and how, etc. That is fertile ground for our next speaker. As I said in the brief introduction, we now move on to Henrietta Wamberg, who is partner at GEL. Henrietta joined GEL 20 years ago, and she now leads the work focused on city transformations. She has worked on many projects in Europe, Asia, America, and elsewhere, and we very much look forward to her presentation.
Thank you very much, Andreas, and thank you everyone for letting me in on your lunch hour. Although I'm not in the same time zone, I'm in Copenhagen now. And thank you for the lovely introduction. It's a pleasure to be part of this forum, and I think it's an absolutely brilliant idea that you are meeting like this and sharing insights, which is a good way of spending everyone's time now. So, can you see it?
Okay. Yep, that's fine.
Okay, so I've got I think Phil had a really good overall framework around, what are the changes we're seeing, and and I'm more kind of feet on the ground. So in that way, hopefully we complement each other in a good way. So what I've been looking at and what we've been discussing in the office over the past month is this kind of the instant transformation we're seeing in cities now, and how that could potentially lead to long-term change, but also what are some of the levers, or what are some of the thoughts and instruments we can use to make that happen. And over time we've been involved in various projects across the world on trying to balance the different transport modes and trying to elevate pedestrians and bicyclists further up the hierarchy, and have that more balanced approach to how we use streets in our cities. And typically, when we work with bicycle projects and do bigger city strategies, we get a lot of these kind of typical responses to bicycling locally on, I think you know them all. It's too wet, it's too hilly, it's too hot, it's too whatever, and it just can't work in our place. So that's kind of the typical thing we get. We did some work in New York's 2008 with the Bloomberg administration that was looking at developing a bicycle network and more available open space across New York, so in Manhattan, but also Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens. And that project was done as temporary installments. So it took 1 year of planning, and it was a 3-year rollout to get everything in place. And that was both bicycle lanes, but it was also this availability. So repurposing some of the streets and putting, whether it was simple or more extravagant bicycling features in, but also reconfiguring some of the spaces. But again, it's interesting to think about that took 1 year to plan and 3 years to roll out. While what we've been seeing for the last couple of months, when we look at, for example, Milan, but also a number of other cities, is how fast these bicycle schemes have been rolled out. So in Rome, it's 150 kilometers of emergency bicycle lanes have been rolled out. Berlin has done a lot. Bogota, Auckland, New Zealand has done a lot. It's around the world where a number of cities are grasping this opportunity to rethink streets out of the sense of urgency that we have to rethink how we use our streets. Of course, London, you know better than me, has plans as well in terms of identifying what are some of the reconfigurations that will have to happen with the current challenge that we're in. Also, I've been doing a lot of work in Australia. This is with the New South Wales Department of Planning, indicating what are some of the measures that we have to change in our cities to accommodate for this pandemic and to accommodate for a new situation where we have to rethink a lot of measures. And when looking at this is a number of these things is something we work for 20 years to change some of this, like the automatic green man crossing signals. So you don't have to apply to cross the street, but that you can actually cross because you are fellow citizens and you're good enough as a pedestrian as if you were in your car. So a lot of this, is now being rolled out very fast with not the same concerns that we've seen in the past, which has been really interesting. Then some of the questions around if these paradigms are shifting, how can we then start to think about making them permanent or feeding them into the whole thinking around our street typology and how streets are laid out. So how do we best use the capacity of our streets? How do we move as many people, as many heads through streets as possible and shift the thinking towards individuals rather than vehicles, but that it's a more broader approach to it. And so that whole thinking around making it permanent and not just this emergency layout that will eventually go away, but how can we really think about creating a network that's open and useful for a number of different people. And for that, it's hard not to think about my hometown, Copenhagen, which of course has been bicycling for a long time. So there's no emergency bicycle lanes out there now. And it has been really well used. So some of these learnings from Copenhagen around how to create a bicycle network for all, also during the pandemic, that everyone is let out, elderly, children, how do we teach them? How do we make sure that once they start at school, they can roll on their own bike, they can go to sport on their own, they can go to school, they can go to friends. So having that individual independence is something that's quite natural for a 6-year-old Copenhagen kid. But I think it's very different in other places. And that, of course, takes away some of these short journeys that Phil mentioned. The short distance journey of just half a kilometer to school or just 1 kilometer to sport, very easily done on a bike and good for everyone. Also just saying that, this goes back to the too hilly, too wet, too windy, too whatever. In Copenhagen, we don't have to bicycle. So these people are not forced to. There's a lot of public transport that's constantly being invested in. We've got more metro coming in. We've got a really well-developed bus system. People can afford their cars and you can drive a car in Copenhagen, as you can see. But people still choose to bike because it's convenient and because they know exactly when they're arriving at work or at their studies. And it's just an easy way of getting around. So reaching that level of where it's a preferred mode of transport and where it's also a comfortable journey. Then other of the learnings, these are cyclists from both London, New York, or other places, of realizing that it's not cyclists, it's just people. So we're not planning for the lycra guy. We're actually planning for the whole display of people, the small kid on the bike, you know, the elderly, and how do we, you know, how do we work with the culture and the thinking around bicycles, so that we see that it's not this specific group, but it's actually all of us, and that we shift modes, and that we also use crappy bikes, you could say, inexpensive bikes, as you go around, and that's perfectly fine. Then other learnings around shifting to a bicycle system also, not that it should be a top star rating all the time, but that it does take a more pleasant environment for people to feel comfortable, but also interested in bicycling for longer trips. So this around taking care of people in a good way, and actually also using that street capacity for not just for vehicles, but also for the street trees, also for the wider pavements, etc. So yeah, other investments in Copenhagen over the past years has been investments in shortening trips through developing bicycle and pedestrian bridges across the harbor and across some canals. And this is a really heavy, expensive investment that we didn't used to do in the past. And it's there now because the economic benefit of doing it. So there's the whole cost and feasibility studies on, if you put this in, this means that more people will actually cycle to studies or cycle to work. That will relieve pressure on the public transport system in the central city area, meaning that you can save a couple of buses, or you don't need an extra rail line to pump in more trains, but that you can get people on their own vehicle and put them through the city, and also cut journey times. We talk a lot about congestion and how much time is wasted when you sit in your car and wait at red lights, but also this whole thinking around how much time is wasted on long detours for bicyclists or pedestrians, and how do we start to then invest that in a different way and also attract more people to actually be active, to have the health benefit. And then just kicking in the whole climate action question, and on how this is this agenda that we also need to address, and how in Copenhagen this has been thought of in a way saying, we know that we are going to have to invest millions of Danish kroner in climate adaptation. How do we make sure that adds extra value? How do we get more out of the money in terms of more attractive places, more bicycle infrastructure, more trees, more whatever, so that there's the whole value question around that, which is then posing questions around, again, how do we use our streets, and is you know, the old way of using it the smartest, or should we think differently? Not across the whole city, so cars are still very much a component of Copenhagen, but in some streets and some corridors we can think differently. Also just bringing Paris in there to say again that Paris, as I'm sure all of you know, have very ambitious plans on climate action, on saying that 50% of the city should be covered by fully rose planted areas by 2030, which is an incredible ambitious goal to have to do that, and have to find the surfaces that you can actually reconfigure. And part of, so the other part of what Paris has been doing is the 15-minute city, where very much it's shifting the whole transport paradigm to be more focused on the active mobility, also on public transport, and saying that 100% of the streets should be cyclable by 2024. So, and the interesting bit about this is that those two go hand in hand, because without the bicycling system, you can't achieve this. And without, you know, without the green, it's harder to achieve this. So those two go hand in hand on how you actually make some of the urgent challenges we've got drivers of a positive change moving forward. So Mayor Hidalgo was just re-elected, so there's another 6 years for Paris in terms of starting to implement that. And then ending now, just on the last note saying, well, the thinking is that the COVID-19 might have peaked and we are sort of moving into normal, or so we hope. But there are plenty of other challenges around, also looking at the health factor of saying, well, we know that in Europe, 23 million annual deaths are caused by physical inactivity. So actually doing what we are doing now, sitting down too much and not being active. So that's a huge challenge to our society and way bigger than COVID-19. So how do we actually take that seriously in the coming years? And how can we think about, for example, bicycling as a measure of lowering mortality, making people more healthy, having less sick days, and also, having a more pleasant journey to work. So, and again, that has been measured in Copenhagen over the years in terms of having an incredible health effect, but also big economic savings. And then saying it's really not an investment in a bicycle system, it's really a saving on a number of other accounts. So that was it for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Henrietta. Thank you, Phil. We now come to the discussion, and there's lots of points to discuss. The first of the blogs was David Rudlin, who pointed out the 15% commuting trips that Phil had mentioned, and related that to the pollution levels and how little an effect that might have on pollution levels, and ask the question if we are really focusing on the wrong target, and whether we should in fact be looking at longer trips to try and change that rather than peak hour traffic. Okay. What do you think about that, Phil? I think the implication of David's question was, should we be supporting high speed too, because that eliminates longer car trips? I may be reading too much into David's question, but certainly
that's probably a difficult area to get into. I guess I was making the point that what I was trying to say was that yes, commuting trips are only a relatively small proportion of the total travel, but they are the trips that transport planners and traffic engineers particularly tend to focus on, because they're the trips that are made in a concentrated period of the day, and therefore they tend to have been used in the past to determine investment strategies. The fact that a motorway junction is uncongested in the middle of the night is immaterial. If it's congested at 7:30 or between 6:30 and 9:30 every morning, then often that is used to justify investment decisions. So it's those commuting trips that are, I think, quite significant. And yes, in terms of total travel, I mean, those are trips. So that wasn't travel; those were numbers of trips, I would say. So if you looked at trip lengths, you would get a different perspective. But thinking about air pollution, obviously air pollution from vehicles is worse during congested conditions, when you have vehicles idling and congested and accelerating and decelerating in urban areas. So again, and where people are living to be recipients of those emissions. So I think still the focus on commuting and within urban areas and those short trips being made by car is quite significant when it comes to the impacts of air quality on human health. Perhaps less so in terms of carbon emissions. Clearly, long distance travel is significant there. And but some of those business trips, you saw Stephen Kinsella's tweet. I don't know how he made those journeys, but it's clear that a lot of business trips, long distance business trips, are made by car. And if they're not made at all, then that is a potentially significant saving.
Okay, thank you, Phil. There were a couple of questions from Hina Hirani. Can we unmute Hina, please, so that she can ask her questions? If not, I can ask them for her. The first question goes to Henrietta, it's all about the cultural change and the behavior. How do you achieve that, and how long does that take? It's obviously key to the transformation, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that there has been in Denmark anyway a long-term collaboration with schools and obviously also kindergartens and workplaces. So quite a lot of collaboration with the places that also generate a lot of trips, and then I think it's the change of culture. I think also comes from, we've seen it the same with, if we compare it with the outdoor cafe culture, like Copenhagen in the 80s, we would say, we're not like the Italians. We would never sit outside and drink cappuccino. It would just won't happen here because the weather is lousy. So, and that has sort of been put to rest. And I think the same on the culture of cycling, that I think that there is that level of traveling to other places and then coming back and thinking, what's the real reason why we couldn't have that here? And that stronger request from the public and push for it. I think also amongst the young and the students, and also, the need for accessing jobs and accessing education without having a car. So I think that whole equity question is interesting also, specifically also when we look globally. Yeah.
A follow-on question, but from a different person, Henrietta. Jonathan Fisher is asking, how has Denmark got past this huge blockage to change, and particularly referring to the political angle that Phil also mentioned. People may want one thing, but the politicians representing them take other decisions for their own reasons. How has Denmark got past this kind of blockage?
Yeah, so it's fair to say that we had the same decline in cycling as the rest of the world, and I think the big game changer for us were the oil crisis in the early 70s, where there was a huge push and public demonstrations for around the environment and climate and taking it seriously, and the growing recognition that this was not the right path. I think also, if we talk about the political level, I'm also pretty sure that it's significant that we don't produce cars. We're not a car producing country. So we don't, like Germany and other places where you have protecting jobs in a specific industry.
Right.
It's never been a question here. So we are bicycle producers. It's a different ballgame. That has made it easier.
Okay. Can I move to Martina Juvara now, who has a question about forecasting the wrong trends?
I think this is both for Phil and Henrietta maybe, is we are in the UK not experimenting enough compared to other European cities where things get done and then if they don't work, it gets removed. And on one hand, somebody here, I'm following the chat, is very interesting. Somebody says, yes, here, if you put something in and then it doesn't work, you're immediately accused and there is a lot of blame game. Yeah. But then on the other hand, you cannot forecast. Phil, your graphs were perfect. You can't forecast change. Forecast is just an extension of what was happening before. So if we want change, we cannot forecast. And if we cannot forecast, we cannot analyze. And therefore we have to experiment. That was my view, but I want to hear yours and Henriette's as well.
I absolutely agree. I think one of the difficulties that we have a very blameworthy culture, I think, in the UK, and I'm not sure where we can lay that, who's created that, but there is a huge problem, and I do understand the nervousness of professional engineers, because when things do go wrong, they can be pilloried. If someone is injured, then they can be called before the coroner's court, and that can really influence decision. I'm quite cynically, we have a thing called road safety audit, which can be quite a dead hand. You know, future schemes are subject to this thing called road safety audit, where someone with experience of collisions predicts what collisions might happen and then recommends changes to the design. And I always think road safety audit is more about the safety of the engineer's job than the safety of the public. But that's really cynical view, and don't repeat that. No, I think that's absolutely right. I think we have to have the freedom to experiment, because the human behavior is so complex, and these models are actually quite simplistic, really, at the heart. And we have this kind of computer says no approach, and we have to somehow find the space to experiment and try things in a low cost way. And if they work, we reinforce them. I think, and what I also mentioned, and just to actually pick up on the last question, I'll just quickly say about how quickly culture can change. For me, the biggest message of the COVID response is the pace of change. You know, if one thing that we take away, because when people say, oh, of course, no point investing in cycling around here because nobody wants to cycle. Well, they can no longer say that. You know, when conditions change, behavior changes. And that, I think, is the biggest lesson for me of the COVID experience.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, the pace of change and the actually willingness to take risk now. I think also it would be interesting to look at what is the risk of not taking a risk. You know, what is the risk of not doing anything, of not addressing air quality, of not, you know, addressing health problems because of this risk aversion, or this kind of what could go wrong. But we know if we don't do anything, a lot of stuff is going wrong constantly. And how can we actually start to forecast that in a better way and look at the implications of just continuing as we're doing and measure that up against, you know, potential risks associated. So I think that could be an interesting way of maybe starting to tilt it a little bit.
Speed is a point that was made by Richard Eastham as well. Can we unmute Richard, please, and see if he has anything more to say about that, the speed of change?
Thank you, yes. Thanks for asking me to contribute. Hi, Phil. Yeah, speed, I think, is something that some cities have really shown that they can just crack on and make change, and the public seem to respond very positively to that. They're not, I don't think the public are as risk averse as the authorities are. Other authorities, perhaps closer to home where I am, are very, very nervous about, you know, what the local paper will say, what the local traders will say. You know, I've been asked to find canvas opinion before they even put a signpost up to talk about COVID streets. And that hesitancy is really, really depressing, really. And I think the talk we heard from Copenhagen about the speed which they can pull a lever under the guise of the pandemic, you know, we have an emergency, let's act quickly. I think that's a lesson to many other places that seem to be, in a way, hiding behind red tape. I don't know what the answer is, but there's clearly examples that people can work far quicker than other places.
Okay. Yep, thank you. I want to go back to the point about risk-taking.
Sorry, Andreas, I'll just make a very quick point.
Yep.
There. Great for, I'm doing some work for the Welsh Government at the moment about bringing in a national default 20-mile-an-hour limit, which is going to be really interesting. There's a vote in the Senate, in the Welsh Parliament, you know, about 10 days' time to endorse the concept of a national 20-mile-an-hour limit in urban areas. But anyway, Adrian Davis, who's been working with me on that. Some of you will know Adrian. His favourite phrase is pluralistic ignorance, and what he means by that is that there is a plurality. Most people, or more people, are in favour of change than are not in favour of change, but they believe they're in the minority. They're ignorant of the fact that there is support for this, and politicians believe that too. So politicians are wrong. There is, and we just need to get the evidence, to gather the evidence that actually people are much more progressive than they themselves think, and the politicians think. You know. So yes,
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Phil. In fact, I'm glad you mentioned the 20-mile-per-hour limit zones, because that was a question from David Lamb as well. Can we bring David in, please?
Yes, hello. Yeah, this is a subject dear to my heart. I'm working in a local area, a high street, for better description, which is going to get some COVID urgent money, and the effort that's going into creating cycle lanes and pavements is interesting, but so much could be done at what I would call low cost or no cost, which is to impose a speed limit in the high street where it's 30 miles an hour, but the majority of vehicles are travelling at a much higher speed. There's danger of death and injury, and there's the problem with noise and air pollution as a result. Just by reducing the speed limit to 20 miles an hour, you solve all these problems of death, injury, noise and pollution. But no one seems to want to talk about it, and it doesn't, in my view, cost anything. And I'm just told, well, we can have a 20 mile an hour, but it's not enforceable. Is this just a myth, or is it a cultural thing? Because it would solve so many of these problems we've got in a cost-aware climate.
Thank you, David. Who wants to take that? Is that you, Phil? Is that
I'm happy to say, and Henrietta, I'm sure I'd be really interested to know where Copenhagen is with 30-kilometre limits. But yeah, so I mentioned the work in Wales, so that's going to be really interesting. I was on a call with police and crime commissioners in Wales a couple of days ago, and it appears there's going to be support there, which is really good. So there is growing support for enforcing wide area 20s. But I should also mention the town of Faversham in Kent, where we've been helping Tim Stoner of Space Syntax and others, and Amanda Russell on the local 20 mile an hour group. And we've just managed to get approval for the first town-wide 20 limit that I'm aware of. So the whole of the town of 20,000 people will be, including the major A roads going into the town centre, will all be a blanket 20. So it is beginning to happen. And I mean, the whole question of enforcement is really complex, because I think the approach that we're going to take in Wales, and I think the Faversham group will as well, is actually about promoting a different kind of behaviour. So, the people who speed are not some other people, they are us. They're the people who live in our town. They are our friends and our neighbours. And if we want to drive at 20, then we can, we just have to slacken off a little bit. So I think it's actually a little more kind of associated with behaviour change and plastic bags and than necessarily enforcement. So.
Okay, thank you, Phil. There are so many more questions. I'm just going to take two now. In fact, there were a couple of points made by Edward Holmes, and then 2 or 3 comments made by Pam Alexander. So can we unmute one after another, these two, please? Is Edward there?
Hi, Andreas.
Yeah. Okay, fire away with your question, Ed.
Well, it was just a discussion about the 20 mile per hour, and it's just contextual in terms of you got to look at the outcome of from the council's point of view. Many London boroughs are already 20 miles per hour, and many have plans to become 20 miles per hour. I think you've got to look at the historical sort of outlook from them, and Cornish Road isn't necessarily going to change to 20 miles per hour because you've got 50 people going along it, opposed to having 500 people going along it in case of London roads. That was just my point.
Okay.
If I can come in at the same time,
yeah.
Taking off my kitchen cleaning gloves. I wanted to say that in Wandsworth we've got quite a lot of 20 mile an hour roads, and they work pretty well. But my main point was to say that we need, particularly after this last 4 months when people have got so many greater and better digital skills, we need to see engaging people not as a reason to object because it causes delay, but as a reason to actually get planning faster, because people like change as long as they can influence it. What they don't like is being done to. And I think there are a couple of great examples, Mini Hollands in Waltham Forest being one of them, where huge opposition to start with was turned around completely into 80% of people being thoroughly in favour and not being in any way willing to let them go back. So I feel we have taken a huge leap forward into the 21st century, both in terms of people being engaged and using digital means of going wider than the few who'll turn up for a cup of tea. or for a professionally led session to get many more people engaged in how we get these changes to happen much faster. Because if people support them, they'll happen faster. Not really a question.
No,
sorry about that.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you. There was a question from Lucas Lee. So can you give the floor to Lucas, please? No? Lucas's question was again about political leadership and whether we needed to have a bigger directive from central government with a national policy towards all these new initiatives. I'm going to ask Phil about this because it relates to another question from Ezra Watts about the risk-adverse local authorities. From your experience, how are you going to get over this kind of the wall, the mentality, the wall mentality, and to break that wall into a new way of thinking and be braver? Yeah.
I think that's well. So I did mention there is actually increasingly strong steer and from government since the launch of the transport decarbonisation plan, and then the advice that I mentioned in my talk about the advice or the new guidance on facilities for walking and cycling. So there is actually really strong direction from government, and the national planning policy framework is actually very strong in favour of walking and cycling in public transport. The problem is that the culture of the profession, I think, or some professions, is kind of lagging behind on that. And so we need a kind of almost a behaviour change campaign for professional attitudes, I think. And how do we do that? It's very difficult. They have to be given space, I think, and room to do things differently. Engineers understandably cling to standards, and those standards are written in the way things we were done and have been done. Because if something goes wrong and they can point, well, I did it according to the standard, it's a very good defense. If they do something completely experimental and it goes wrong, that's that can be really perilous for their career. So I can absolutely understand, and somehow we need to create a kind of safety net around that and allow people to experiment, and it just needs that, again, a political dimension to allow that to happen somehow. Okay.
Thank you. Before I go to Richard Walker's question, I realized that I didn't give the opportunity to Henrietta to tell us about the Danish way of implementing and introducing 20, or should I say 30-kilometer-hour zones. So Henrietta, over to you.
Thank you. So that is, I think it's one of the ingredients in Copenhagen that is used together with a number of other factors. So in the central city area, that has been, or the kind of medieval core, that has been the regime for the last 30 years maybe, where now kind of the next step is moving towards actually pedestrianizing a larger part of that core to kind of taking the next steps towards it. But definitely the 30-kilometer streets are an important measure around how we can change streets, and also this whole thinking around shared space, how we can mix traffic levels once the speed of cars is really low, maybe down to 20 or 15 kilometers per hour, we can start to mix the modes in a different way. I know Barcelona, I think that really well, also has a very strong regime on 30-kilometer-hour traffic zones, and it's definitely, I think, maybe also the signal effect of it is important.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I've just been told we are running out of time very soon. So Richard Walker, you're going to ask your question very quickly.
Hi. It wasn't so much a question as a comment that we might as well have pedestrian priority. I think 20 miles an hour is a step towards pedestrian priority rather than cars beeping their horns and expecting everybody else to get out of the way.
Yeah, thank you. And that was quick enough for me to allow Claire and Martin to come in as well. Claire, you had a point to make as well.
Yeah, my point is that there seems to be too much space given over to car storage, on our streets. And as somebody who started to try and cycle, the problem in our residential area where the streets are quite narrow is that there's just not enough space to make it feel comfortable for a novice cyclist.
Yes.
So I think things just have to be much more radical if we're going to make this shift, and that we have to think quite differently about moving around within towns and cities than we do moving between places. And at the moment, the rules for moving between places seem to be being imposed on moving around within our neighborhoods.
Yeah. Would either of the speakers like to comment quickly on that? Or
I think it's a really important point, and if you look at Paris, that's exactly what is part of what they're looking at. So they will decrease the amount of on-street parking with 75%. So that's bringing it down from 85,000 to 23. So it's actually taking 60,000 parking spots out of Paris entirely, and it's saying that space is needed for bicycling infrastructure, footpaths, but it's also needed for more trees, dealing with the heat island effect, cooling the city by 5 degrees, instead of frying everyone over summer. And we need the space for it, and there's a better use for it now than what there was in the past. So that is important to rethink the use of square meters in a different way.
Fantastic. I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to, first of all, I'd like to thank Stephen Gallagher and Sonia Bangol from the Academy for making all this happen, and for helping me with the running of this event. But in particular, I'd like to thank our two speakers. I'm sure you all agree they've made fantastic contributions, and we are grateful for that. Thank you also to all of you, the participants, and I'm going to leave you with a quote from the Secretary of State. Phil has already made reference to Grant Shapps, but this quote is quite important. It was made at the beginning of lockdown. He said, "Walking and cycling will become the norm for urban travel, with cars pushed to the periphery. We all come out of this recovery stronger by permanently changing the way we use transport." Let's hope that that comes true. Once again, on behalf of the Academy, thank you so much, and see you at the next lunch hour event in a week's time.